Tanya Jefferson was a woman of resilience and unwavering determination. Working as a waitress at the Golden Fork, an upscale restaurant located in the heart of the city, she had mastered the art of multitasking. From serving wealthy patrons to dealing with the management's endless demands, Tanya's life was filled with challenges that would have broken many others. But Tanya was made of sterner stuff. Every day she would rise before dawn, make her way to the restaurant, and face the long hours with the quiet fortitude of someone who had seen enough hardships to know that life rarely gave you a break. At 27, Tanya was still single and without many friends. Her life revolved around the restaurant and her sick mother who had been suffering from diabetes for the past few years. Tanya had always been a dutiful daughter, and even though her own dreams were buried deep within her, she never hesitated to care for her mother, even as her health continued to deteriorate. Tanya's mother was everything to her. The woman had raised Tanya alone after her father passed away when Tanya was only a child. Over the years, Tanya had learned to survive on her own, but it was her mother's unwavering strength and kindness that had shaped the woman she had become. Golden Fork was a place where society's elite gathered to indulge in luxury. The chandeliers sparkled with the soft glow of expensive crystals, the silver cutlery gleamed in the light, and the rich aroma of gourmet dishes filled the air. Tanya had become part of the polished yet invisible world that ran behind the scenes. She was the one who served their meals, cleaned their tables, and dealt with the aftermath of their gluttony. The restaurant's owner, Robert Manning, was a man who epitomized the arrogance and entitlement that came with his wealth. At 55, Manning was always impeccably dressed in the finest suits, and his demeanor exuded a cold and calculated confidence that made Tanya feel insignificant in his presence. For all her hard work, Tanya never received any recognition from Manning. In fact, he treated his employees like mere objects tools to be used for his own gain. Tanya had often felt his icy stare from across the room, the silent judgment in his eyes as she served customers, and every time he addressed her it was with a tone that dripped with condescension. "Tanya, make sure those tables are set up properly," he would say, his voice devoid of warmth. There was always an unspoken message in his words. "You're lucky to have a job here." But Tanya had learned to swallow her pride and carry on focusing on the one thing that mattered to her, taking care of her mother. Her days were long, filled with endless work and little rest. When she wasn't working at the restaurant, she was at home taking care of her mother, trying to manage her worsening health. Tanya knew that her mother's time was running out, but she didn't know how to face a future without her. The thought of losing her was unbearable. Yet, Tanya continued to push forward day after day because she had no other choice. She couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to break down. One particularly cold winter evening after the last of the restaurant's guests had left and the kitchen was being cleaned, Tanya stood at the back door washing the final dishes of the night. The kitchen was silent, except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the soft sound of water running over the dishes. As she finished up, she heard a faint rustling at the back door. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but then it came again louder, this time a soft, hesitant knock. She froze, unsure of what to do. When she opened the door, her eyes fell upon two small figures standing in the dim light of the alley. 2 children no older than 8, and 10 were huddled together, shivering in tattered clothes. Their faces were pale from the cold and their eyes were wide with fear, but there was a pleading desperation in their gaze. Tanya's heart immediately went out to them. She could see the hunger in their eyes, the way their small bodies trembled with the cold, and without thinking, she stepped forward and opened the door wider to let them in. "What are you doing here?" Tanya asked softly, trying not to startle them. Her voice was gentle, filled with concern. The older boy, his face drawn and pale, looked up at her with fear in his eyes. We're sorry," he stammered, clutching his younger sister's hand tightly. "We're so hungry." Tanya's heart broke. She glanced around quickly, her mind racing. It was the dead of night, and the streets were empty. There was no one else around, and no one could help these children. She hurried inside, grabbing a steaming bowl of soup and a few leftover rolls from the kitchen. She handed them to the children, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the food into their hands. The boy's eyes lit up with gratitude, and his sister smiled, her face lighting up with a warmth Tanya hadn't seen in years. Tanya had no idea who these children were or where they had come from, but in that moment, she knew she couldn't turn them away. She couldn't bear the thought of leaving them to starve on the streets. They were just children, innocent, hungry, and scared. And she was the only one who could help them. "I'll bring you food every night," Tanya said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Just come to the back door after dark. I'll make sure you're not hungry anymore." From that night on, Tanya prepared extra food after each shift at the restaurant and left it at the back door for Eli and Na. The children who had been orphaned after a car accident that claimed their parents' lives had been living on the streets. They had no one to turn to and no place to go. Tanya's quiet kindness, however, soon drew the children to trust her. They told her their names, Eli and Na, and over the weeks that followed, they grew close to her. Tanya's heart swelled with a quiet joy each time they came to her for help. But as the weeks passed, Tanya's actions began to draw attention, and not the kind she wanted. One evening, after she had given food to Eli and Na, she turned to find Robert Manning standing behind her, his face contorted in anger. "What do you think you're doing, Tanya?" he demanded, his voice icy. "This is a fine dining establishment, not a charity." "I'm just helping these children," Tanya said, her voice trembling but resolute. "They were hungry. I couldn't just leave them out there." Manning sneered, his expression darkening. "You're stealing from this restaurant," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you know what that means?" Tanya stood there, her hands shaking, but she refused to back down. "I understand, sir, but I couldn't leave them to starve." His eyes narrowed, and with a swift, dismissive gesture, he fired her. "You're done here," he said, his voice cold as ice. "I won't have someone like you tarnishing my restaurant's reputation." Tanya stood frozen as he slammed the door behind him, leaving her alone in the dark, bitter night. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. The children who had been huddling nearby burst into tears, terrified that their actions had cost Tanya her job. But Tanya hugged them close, her heart aching for them. She had lost her job, but she would never abandon these children. Despite the public humiliation and the rumors that Manning spread about her being a thief, Tanya refused to let go of her promise. She continued to care for Eli and Na, taking on any odd jobs she could find to support them. But as time passed, her situation grew even more desperate. The door that had once been open to her now slammed shut. No one would hire her, and she was left to scrape by working jobs that left her exhausted and drained. But she never gave up. Every night she would take food to the children, making sure they had enough to eat. Even though she had lost her dignity and her career, Tanya found solace in knowing that at least she had given something meaningful to those who needed it most. This first chapter establishes Tanya's humble beginnings, her acts of kindness, and the beginning of her downfall, setting the stage for the challenges that lie ahead in the story. The emotions of love, sacrifice, and resilience are woven throughout, as Tanya remains determined to care for the children she has promised to protect. Tanya no longer had a job at Golden Fork, the upscale restaurant where she had spent many years working tirelessly to serve the wealthy elite. Losing her job didn't just leave Tanya financially unstable, it also made her a target for judgment and scorn from society. She had been kicked out by her employer, Robert Manning, who had used his influence to destroy her reputation, making it nearly impossible for Tanya to find another job. Word spread quickly that she had been fired for stealing food, a lie that tarnished her name in the eyes of the community. No one would hire her, and soon even the smallest jobs were out of her reach. Days stretched into weeks, and Tanya found herself in a fight for survival. She would wake up before dawn, wrap herself in a worn coat, and head out to hand out flyers for a local grocery store. The cold winter mornings were brutal, and her hands, cracked from the icy air, trembled as she clutched the stack of flyers. Yet despite the pain and the exhaustion, Tanya continued one step after another, hoping that one day things would get better. But every passerby she encountered seemed to look at her with disdain, some sneering or shaking their heads as they avoided her eyes. She was now the epitome of failure in their eyes. By the time the sun had fully risen, Tanya was already at work, trying to find another odd job. She would spend hours washing cars at a local garage, her hands becoming raw and rough from the cold water and harsh detergents. In the evenings, she would clean office buildings, vacuuming empty hallways under the dim light of fluorescent bulbs. It was grueling work, but it paid just enough to cover the basics. Though she had lost everything, her job, her dignity, and her social standing, Tanya never gave up. No matter how humiliated she felt, no matter how many doors were slammed in her face, she kept moving forward. Her mother, still sick and frail, needed her, and Eli and Na, though they were no longer in her care, were always on her mind. Tanya's daily routine was physically exhausting, but it was the emotional toll that truly wore her down. She would often return home late at night, her body aching and her spirit heavy with the weight of the day's struggles. Still, she never stopped thinking about Eli and Na. She knew that they were out there somewhere, but they were no longer in her life. It was a thought that gnawed at her heart every day, but she couldn't let herself break. One evening, as she returned home from a particularly long day of cleaning offices, Tanya made her way to the back alley behind the restaurant. She had been leaving food there every night for Eli and Na, hoping they would come for it. But as she stood there, gazing into the empty street, she realized that the alley was eerily quiet. No children came running up to her, no voices filled the air with gratitude. Tanya stood still for a moment, her heart sinking into her chest. It had been weeks since she last saw them. Where were they? Were they okay? Tanya waited for what felt like an eternity, her anxiety building as she stood in the cold. Finally, a neighbor approached her. He was an older man, his face worn from years of hard work. He had always been a friendly face in the neighborhood, but tonight, his expression was somber. "I'm sorry, Tanya," the man said softly, avoiding her eyes. "The social services took the children. I heard they sent them to a foster home somewhere far away." Tanya's heart felt as if it had shattered into 1,000 pieces. She froze, unable to process what she had just heard. Eli and Na, the children she had fought so hard to protect, had been taken away. She couldn't understand it. Why? Why now she had kept her promise to them? She had cared for them, loved them, and protected them. And yet they were gone. Her feet felt heavy as she turned and walked back home, each step feeling like a battle. The weight of the news settled over her, suffocating her. She hadn't just lost her job, her reputation, and her dignity. Now she had lost the children who had given her a reason to keep fighting. She felt as though she was drifting untethered in a world that seemed too cruel and unforgiving to make sense of. That night, when Tanya arrived home, she found her mother in her hospital bed asleep, but still breathing, fragile and pale. Tanya sat by her side, holding her mother's hand as tears slipped down her cheeks. Mama Tanya whispered, her voice trembling with grief. "I don't know what to do anymore. I've lost everything. I've lost my job. I've lost my dignity. And now I've lost Eli and Na. How much more can I take?" Her mother, who had been in and out of consciousness for weeks, opened her eyes and grasped Tanya's hand with what little strength she had left. Her voice was weak, but filled with love and wisdom. Tanya, my dear, you cannot let these trials break you. Life is filled with injustices, but you must never let them define you. These hardships you're facing, they are not the end. They are the fuel that will change your destiny. Promise me, Tanya, that you will never let anyone look down on you again. Tanya looked into her mother's eyes, seeing the depth of love and sacrifice that had shaped her entire life. And in that moment, a flicker of something sparked within Tanya's heart. She couldn't give up. She had to keep going, not just for herself, but for the children she had promised to protect. With the loss of her mother, Tanya was left alone to face the harsh reality of her situation. But her mother's words echoed in her mind, reminding her that there was still hope. She couldn't let herself be defeated, not when there was still so much to fight for. She made a promise to herself that night. She would not let Manning's cruelty or the injustice that had been forced upon her win. Over the next few weeks, Tanya's determination grew stronger. She started to gather evidence of Manning's actions, documenting everything she could about his discriminatory behavior and the false accusations he had made about her. She knew that this would be her chance to stand up to him, to fight back, and prove that she was not the person he had made her out to be. One evening, as she was cleaning an office building in the middle of the night, Tanya overheard a conversation that would change the course of her life. She had been dusting the conference room when she heard the voice of Robert Manning from the adjacent room. She paused, straining to hear. "This deal with the Hanscom Group is the most important one we've ever had," Manning's voice said, filled with arrogance. "We cannot afford to screw this up. Do whatever it takes to make sure it happens. And for God's sake, don't let any of those people like her near the signing. No one from her kind." Tanya's blood ran cold as she listened to Manning's words. She knew now that not only had he ruined her life, but he was continuing to spread hatred and discrimination at every opportunity. The realization hit her like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just about her. This was about all the lives Manning had destroyed, all the people he had trampled on in his quest for power. The next morning, Tanya reached out to Marcus Chun, an old friend of her mother's who had become a lawyer. She shared everything she had gathered, every piece of evidence, every lie, and every cruel word Manning had ever spoken. Tanya knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. It was time to bring Manning down, not for revenge, but for justice. Marcus listened intently, his expression growing grave as Tanya recounted the events. When she finished, he looked at her with admiration and determination. "We're going to take him down, Tanya. You've done something extraordinary. And now we're going to make sure that Robert Manning pays for everything he's done." In this chapter, Tanya's life is filled with setbacks and struggles, but it also marks a pivotal turning point. Her relentless determination and her unwillingness to give up on what's right drive her to gather the evidence she needs to confront Robert Manning. The chapter emphasizes her resilience and growth as she begins to transform her suffering into the foundation of a fight for justice, not only for herself, but for others who have been wronged by people like Manning. Months had passed since Tanya began her fight for justice, and the weight of her decision to confront Robert Manning felt heavier every day. The emotional toll of her past struggles, the pain of losing her job, her dignity, her beloved mother and Eli and Na still lingered like a shadow over her. But she had made a promise to herself, and now she was more determined than ever. With Marcus Chun's help, Tanya had gathered the evidence she needed to take down Manning. It was no longer just about her. It was about all the victims who had suffered at the hands of people like him. And it was time for Manning to face the consequences of his actions. Tanya had spent countless hours with Marcus organizing the evidence into a foolproof legal case. Every document, every photograph, every audio recording that she had painstakingly collected while cleaning offices late at night, all of it was crucial to the case they were building. She knew that this fight wouldn't be easy. Robert Manning was a powerful man, with connections that reached far and wide. But Tanya wasn't afraid. She had already lost so much, and now she had everything to gain. The day of the hearing arrived, and Tanya stood in front of a packed courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was filled with reporters, lawyers, and spectators, all eager to see the showdown between Tanya Jefferson and Robert Manning. As the judge entered the room, Tanya's mind raced. She was just one woman standing alone against a man who had destroyed so many lives, including hers. But Tanya wasn't alone anymore. She had Marcus by her side, and she had the truth on her side. Manning walked into the courtroom, his usual air of arrogance on full display. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his posture rigid as he glanced around the room. His cold blue eyes locked onto Tanya's for a brief moment, and she could see the hatred burning in them. But Tanya didn't flinch. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. The trial began, and Tanya's testimony was the first to be heard. She recounted the events of that fateful night when she was fired from Golden Fork, how she had been humiliated and ostracized by Manning, and how he had used his influence to ruin her reputation. She spoke about the nights she spent feeding Eli and Na, the two orphaned children she had cared for, and how Manning's cruelty had forced her into a life of poverty and hardship. Every word she spoke was filled with emotion, but also with the unwavering strength of someone who had suffered and fought through it all. When Tanya finished, the courtroom was silent. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, and even the reporters who had come to witness the trial seemed to be in awe of her courage. Next came Manning's defense. His lawyer tried to paint Tanya as a disgruntled employee who had fabricated the entire story. He accused her of using the children to manipulate the situation, claiming that she was only trying to bring down a successful businessman out of jealousy. But Tanya didn't let his words get to her. She had already heard it all before. The lies, the insults, the accusations. And this time, she had something that would expose the truth. It was Marcus's turn to present the evidence. He carefully laid out the documents that Tanya had collected over the past few months. Photographs of Manning's discriminatory actions, fake invoices, payroll records, showing clear instances of racial bias, and most damning of all, the recorded conversations of Manning spewing racist slurs and using his position to control others. The evidence was irrefutable, and even the most skeptical in the courtroom had to admit that Manning had been caught red-handed. As the trial continued, Tanya could feel the tension building in the air. The more the evidence mounted, the more desperate Manning became. His usual confidence was slipping away, and by the time Marcus had finished presenting the case, it was clear that there was no way out for him. The judge called for a recess, and Tanya stood in the hallway, her hands trembling as she fought to control her emotions. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. During the recess, Tanya was approached by a reporter from a local news station. "Miss Jefferson, how does it feel to finally be standing up to Robert Manning?" The reporter asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Tanya paused for a moment, thinking carefully before answering. "It feels like justice is finally being served," Tanya said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "For so long I've been silenced, treated like I didn't matter. But today I'm standing here because the truth is on my side. No one should have to go through what I went through, and no one should ever be made to feel inferior just because of the color of their skin or their position in life." The reporter nodded, clearly moved by Tanya's words. "And what happens now?" she asked. "If the judge rules in your favor, what will you do?" Tanya smiled softly, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "I'll continue to fight. I'll continue to fight for those who have no voice, for those who have been silenced by people like him. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's ever been pushed down and told they didn't matter. And I won't stop until I've done everything I can to make this world a fairer place." When the trial resumed, the judge delivered his verdict. It was a moment Tanya would never forget. Robert Manning, the judge, said, his voice stern, "You have been found guilty of racial discrimination, unlawful termination, and misconduct. The evidence presented by Miss Jefferson is both compelling and undeniable. You have used your position to harm others for far too long, and now you will face the consequences." Manning's face drained of color as the judge's words sank in. For the first time, he looked truly afraid. The courtroom erupted into applause, and Tanya felt a surge of relief wash over her. It was over. After all the pain and suffering she had won. But for Tanya, this victory was about more than just herself. It was about everyone who had been marginalized, oppressed, and silenced by people like Robert Manning. It was about showing the world that no matter how powerful or wealthy someone might be, they would always be held accountable if they harmed others. As she left the courthouse that day, Tanya felt a sense of liberation that she hadn't known in years. For the first time in a long time, she could breathe freely, knowing that justice had been served. As the days passed, Tanya's life began to change in ways she never could have imagined. She received messages of support from people she had never met, all thanking her for her courage and determination. Eli and Na, who had heard about the trial on the news, reached out to her, eager to reconnect. They had grown into successful, compassionate adults, and their gratitude for Tanya's kindness all those years ago had only grown stronger with time. But Tanya wasn't done yet. She knew that this was just the beginning. She had spent years fighting for her own survival, but now she wanted to help others who were still trapped in the same cycles of injustice. With Eli and Na by her side, she decided to create a foundation, the Tanya El Nina Foundation, dedicated to fighting discrimination and providing support for those who had been oppressed by systems of inequality. The foundation quickly gained momentum, attracting the attention of philanthropists, activists, and organizations who shared Tanya's vision for a fairer world. Eli, with his business acumen, took charge of the organization's fundraising efforts, while Na, a rising star in the legal field, provided legal support to those in need. Tanya, as the heart and soul of the foundation, worked tirelessly to raise awareness and build partnerships with other organizations. As the foundation grew, so did Tanya's sense of purpose. She had transformed her pain into something powerful, something that could change lives. And as she stood in front of a crowd at a press conference, watching as Eli and Na spoke about their shared vision for a better future, Tanya knew that she had finally found her true calling. Tanya's victory over Robert Manning wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a turning point in her life and the lives of countless others. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she no longer had to fight alone. She had found a family in Eli and Na, and together they were determined to make the world a better place for everyone who had been wronged. The fight wasn't over, but Tanya knew that as long as they had each other, they could face anything that came their way.